Well, hey guys, welcome back to BiblioFiles. It's good to see your faces again after a little bit of a break. I hope you're all feeling refreshed. I'm feeling refreshed.
I'm feeling refreshed.
He's feeling refreshed. Megan.
Refreshed, my friend.
Emily.
Short.
Missy.
Quite refreshed. Thank you.
Perfect. I'm so glad. You guys, I couldn't be more excited for this new season of BiblioFiles. This is a pet topic of mine. We're going to talk about movies
For a whole season.
We're going to talk about
aren't
movies.
Books.
Hey now, save your. So here's the idea. We love movies at CenterForLit because we love stories at CenterForLit. And well, let's put it this way. How many times have you encountered the question in your life as a lover of literature, talking to people who love books? How many times have you encountered the question, is it wrong to watch the movie before I've read the book?
Or the way that people get so angry about film adaptations. I mean, I don't engage on Facebook. I just kind of lurk there.
Right.
But the number of times that people just poo-poo the movie of a book because it wasn't exactly whatever or what have you. I would engage if I was braver, but I am not.
So what you're saying is you're going to engage here and now.
Right. We go off into our office where no one can get to us, and we engage from the private of our home.
We lob grenades out into the social media world.
Well, if you are among you listeners, if you are among the people who believe it is wrong to view a movie that has a book associated with it, you might want to listen elsewhere, because we are going to recommend over the course of this season some great film adaptations, as well as panning some poor ones. But before we do any of that, I thought I would start with an episode where I hear your guys' thoughts on the intersection between these art forms. I mean, obviously they're all stories, and so they share some things that we can trot out, I'm sure. But I would love to hear from you guys in your own lives as movie watchers, how you think these art forms differ. What categories do you consider as you read a film? Popcorn
The problem
style,
is you
whoever
don't
wants to
read
go.
a film. You don't read a film at all. You watch a film, and I think the thing that's
air
lost in
quotes were-
translation.
That was part of the.
You had to
The
say air
quotes part.
quote though, because
Anyway, we interrupted you, Missy.
I know. I was giving a dramatic caesura.
Oh,
there.
okay. All right. Fair enough.
I read that.
Can you say caesura if it's not poetry? Maybe not.
I read
There's
that.
a long pause. Anyway, what I was starting to say is that the thing that I think gets lost in translation when you take something from a book to a movie is the reader's imagination. Because basically what you get is a producer's imagination working on a piece of literature and then depicting it, taking it from story to screen is an act of analysis, really. They're basically saying, here are the parts of this story that are the most important. Here's my reading of this particular story. And you don't get the story, you get one person's reading of the story, which is useful if you're also reading the story, because you can go in conversation with the producer. But if you haven't read the story before you watch the movie, then you're left only with his idea, which is derivative of an original art form.
You're right. You're absolutely right. But that also wasn't the question. The question was, what categories do we consider as we watch a movie? Period.
Yeah.
We'll get into adaptations, and that's going to be the subject of the season. But let's give an introduction to the art form. How is it different? And no answer is too obvious. How is it different from the literary art form?
I would offer a counterpoint to all of that and say that in response to the idea that you don't read a film, I would actually say, if we're taking read kind of loosely to mean interpret, that actually there are far more elements to read of a film than there are a movie. There is an actual text, there's a screenplay, and then there's the image. So you're reading it like you would read a work of art or a piece of theater, right? It's a visual, it's oral, you're listening to it, and there's music involved. So all of those things combined, there's several different tracks of reading that you have to run at the same time.
Wow. Okay. So, does that mean you have to be an expert on all of those individual art forms that come together to make a movie?
In order to do what?
In order to, heavy air quotes, read the movie?
Well, I would say this.
Oh, go ahead,
Megan.
Jinx, you owe me a Coke, both of y'all.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Dad, go ahead.
I was going to say I would say the same thing to that question about movies that I would say if you asked it to me about books. The more you know about the things that go into writing a story, the more you know about how a novel is put together, the deeper your pleasure is going to be. As your understanding deepens, your pleasure and enjoyment of the art form will deepen. So if Emily's right, and there are actually a half a dozen facets of quote unquote reading that you do when you're watching a movie, then yeah, expertise in any one or more, multiple of those facets is going to deepen your pleasure and understanding. On the other hand, it's the same as with stories. Little kids who don't have expertise in any of the disciplines, related to storytelling, still love them.
Right.
And we go to the movies because we love it. So.
Right. And I actually remember when growing up, Dad, if someone in our family had seen the movie before and wanted to interpret for everyone else and warn them as to what was coming, the popular line in our family was, this movie was created for people who haven't seen it before. Pipe down.
Never forget, this was made for people who've never seen it before.
Right. Be quiet and act like a child and let this piece of art work on you, and we'll analyze later. I think that a healthy combination of the two views would make you an excellent critic of movies.
I like that. So, but you said something just now I want to zoom in on. You said work on you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys think that a novel and a film have different goals in terms of how they intend to work on their recipient, on their viewer, or on their reader?
I was thinking about that today, believe it or not, and was thinking about the recent experiences I've had with watching these kinds of movies, the kinds that we're going to be discussing this season, and thinking that the experience of the viewer of a film is fundamentally different than the experience of the reader of a novel or the reader of an epic or a play or something. And maybe there's lots of ways that's different, but the one that I was sort of toying with today even was that kind of like, as Missy said a minute ago, because the film is another reader's imagination bringing to life what he's read in a story.
Yeah, a story. Yeah.
It's one level removed from you, the viewer. So when you watch a movie, you are, if it's The Great Gatsby from the F. Scott Fitzgerald novel, you watch a movie version of The Great Gatsby, you are one remove from Fitzgerald, one extra remove from Fitzgerald than you would be if you were reading the novel yourself. Yeah. You're getting Baz Luhrmann's imagination. What does this text call up in his mind, as opposed to calling it up in your own mind? And so I think that the way that it works on you is different because of that.
So do you think that goes backwards into, again, taking one step back from literary adaptations as a movie category and into film more generally? Do you think that applies to a filmmaker sets out to do something different than a novelist?
Well, yeah, I think so. And I was going there. I think maybe you guys unpack this and tell me if this is even worth talking about, but you put yourself in the role of the protagonist in a novel in a way that is harder to do it in the film. And maybe you're not even supposed to do it in film. In film, you're watching a protagonist who is very clearly somebody else. It's Tom Hanks playing a role. It's right. It's you're observing a protagonist do his thing. In a novel, the whole idea is that the line between you and the protagonist is supposed to be blurry, and you're in his shoes more immediately, in a way that you're not with film. And I wonder if this is arguable, of course, but I wonder if the cathartic element of literature is more immediate as a result than the cathartic element of film.
That is so interesting. Let's go to Megan and then Emily. Megan?
Well, that immediately made me think of distinctions between my experiences of protagonists in movies. I thought of a Humphrey Bogart film whose name escapes me at the moment, where you begin the story looking through the lens of the camera as if you are the character. And you watch the first half of that movie bouncing around a little bit as if you are running through the movie and the perspective is your own. No, it's a
No?
Humphrey Bogart film, and it's about he gets like plastic surgery done on his face, and you don't get to see him actually until that's been done. And then his new face, quote unquote, is Humphrey Bogart's. It's a great movie. I
Why
would
would
recommend it
anyone
if I could remember what
Making
it
a
was.
face from
you know?
scratch, choose Humphrey Bogart's face. Anyway.
Gentle. He's a classic.
He
Well,
also
there's
can't
some
defend himself.
right. But the reason that I call that particular movie to mind is that seems to be, like you were saying, Dad, the director's attempt to break down that wall between the audience and the protagonist and offer them a book version of an experience in his world that he created. And the same thing, I see it done in Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca as well. That main character doesn't have a name. And so her identity is kind of non-person, and she is not unique from the reader. You become the protagonist experiencing this strange landscape in her world. So I see that happening in both a book and a movie. And I think maybe that's just another facet of either art form rather
how we
than a
tell
distinction
stories.
between the two.
Interesting. Emily, what do you think
Maybe.
about that?
I agree with Megan. I think that it's done that you do that in movies more than you think. But also what it called to mind for me is an anecdote I heard about Stephanie Myers, who wrote the Twilight series, and the fact that she intentionally hollowed out the protagonist, Bella, so that young teenage girls could insert themselves into that role and see themselves. And that is actually one of the things that parents were concerned about, because it gets young girls carried away with these wild emotions that aren't necessarily healthy. And so I don't know how much that actually factors. Yes, we're to sympathize with the protagonist, but their differences are to ourselves are just as important as their similarities, I think. And I think you experience the same thing in film, like watching someone else.
You don't necessarily see that extra distance that Dad was talking about.
Well, yeah, in some senses you should see yourself in a protagonist, but in other ways you really shouldn't see yourself. You should see an other in a protagonist, and film just makes that barrier of otherness more clear.
I think I would go that far at least, and I would say that the because there is a visual image, because protagonist is being played by a recognizable person that isn't you, there is an extra distance that isn't there when the whole picture of the thing is something you're creating yourself as you read. Yeah. I don't know if that, Missy, I might have interrupted you. Go ahead.
I was just thinking about the question and wanted to take another stab at it since I understand what you were asking better. And I kind of wonder if the difference between film and novel, for example, between the screen and the written word, is maybe the difference between Edgar Allan Poe's artistic sensibilities and, say, Matthew Arnold or someone like him.
Okay,
the difference being because Edgar Allan Poe is all about art for art's sake and heightened emotions and, titillating the senses and all of that sort of thing. So it's a very sensory approach to art. I think the screen really lends itself to that because of all the elements that Emily mentioned, even the music, right, that appeals to the emotions. And they're trying to draw all of your senses into this thing that you're watching through sumptuous photography and lavish sound and beautiful people and sparkling dialogue. In a novel, it seems like it's appealing to your heart through your mind, right? It's using the imaginative faculty to take you on an emotional journey. Certainly you arrive, we hope your emotions get involved. But everything is done through imagery and you have to imagine all of it. And there's a real strong, obviously, goes without saying that the thing they lean on the hardest is language.
Right.
And it is one of the things that I think doesn't translate onto the screen unless in sheer dialogue, right? All of the stuff, all of the wonderful literary language and style and all that sort of thing. In a movie, you have to somehow get there via the music. Take To Kill a Mockingbird, which I think is linguistically lovely.
Yeah, it's
and
beautiful.
I think though they did a fabulous, and we'll talk about this later, though they did a fabulous screen adaptation of it, I still think that it didn't hold a candle to the book. right? I think it's the best screen adaptation maybe ever done, but it didn't hold a candle to Harper Lee's.
Well, if I could
efforts.
get in and paraphrase, and feel free to correct me if I misrepresent you here, but it sounds like what you're saying is that the two different art forms aim for the same thing from different ends of this continuum.
No,
On the
that's
one
not
end,
what
you
I meant
have.
to say.
Well, let me finish the thought, and then you can decide at that point. Okay. So on the one end, you have an art form that specifically says, I am language. So you have to engage your brain to encounter the emotional things that I want to affect your heart. And that's the novel. On the other hand, you have a film that says, I'm going to reach you through your heart, through your senses. And I'm going to cause you to think about what the experience that you just had.
Maybe.
And maybe the goal is the same down in the middle, but they're working on different parts of you first in that attempt. Is that a fair characterization of what was going through your head?
What I was trying to suggest that there is more danger, I think, of someone watching a movie and never thinking about it than there is somebody reading a book and never engaging their brain with it. I've watched so many people watch a movie with a slack jaw and then walk away and not remember that they ever saw it. It's harder to do, not impossible, but harder to do if you're actually reading well. Right. And you could argue, I'm sure, that if you're watching well, then that wouldn't happen either. But there's something about the art form, the film form, is that it appeals to your senses, and you can just have a sensory experience and never think about what you're supposed to be thinking about in the film.
See, I don't know. And I won't say absolutely not, because I think definitely I've had viewing experiences like that. I've been interested in having them occasionally, even. Let's go hit the couch and binge some Netflix. I don't want to think right now. That's a valid way of using film. But I also think, though, that we're talking about degrees of artistry. I would argue that a great film does what it does to you because of the effectiveness of the art, in the same way that a great novel does what it does to you because of the effectiveness of the art. And yes, there is a grammar that you have to acquire in order to really understand it. But it exists just like in literature. And I think they can ultimately both have profound impacts on you.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I wouldn't argue that.
No, I wouldn't argue that at all.
Yeah.
I mean, visual performed story is is a human tradition that is every bit as old as written stories written down,
and is valid.
Right, of course.
You didn't ask is one form valid and the other one not. You're asking how do they differ, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure. So let's go into adaptations more specifically, right? Because that's where the conversation is going to center. And a quick review, maybe. I think we're going to have fun noting the other elements that film brings to the table. And one thing I noticed myself that I would love to talk about a little bit is the fact that it's such a partnership, that it requires so many minds to bring a film to life. And Emily listed a bunch of them, right? You've got the person writing the soundtrack, the people involved in recording the soundtrack, which is itself an act of interpretation of the melody that this other guy wrote down. Then you've got the screenwriter who's in charge of writing the story and writing the book, as it were, for the film. Then you've got the guy that comes in and says, the dialogue's not working here. Let's punch this up a little, scene to scene. So there's, oftentimes rooms and rooms fulls of writers working on the script. Then you've got actors interpreting the script themselves and their own emotions with the aid of a director whose vision it is that's being brought to the screen, hopefully. But the director's usually not the guy behind the camera. Sometimes he is, but there's almost always a cinematographer involved or a director of photography who's in charge of taking what he hears from the director and what he's read in the script and what he sees from the actors and putting the camera in the right spot, to say nothing of lighting and costumes. And it's this impossibly large collaborative work of art.
Don't forget the key grip.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't forget the
key grip and the gaffer.
To do everything that your imagination does all by its onesies.
Right. Which on the one hand is true. I'm not arguing with you that your imagination can do all of those things, but it is, since the beginning of time, an incredible experience as a human being to watch someone else's brain do it, and to watch 100 someone else's brains do it all in concert. This is why we listen to Handel's Messiah instead of humming it to ourselves in our shower. Right? There's something about collaborative
That's a great comparison.
Art, something about collaborative human art that is innately powerful.
Absolutely.
So what we want to talk about in this season, though, is how do these two things intersect? Because everybody's had the experience of watching a film adaptation of a book that they loved and saying, that is not how it went down, or that's not what that guy looks like, or
Right.
that's not in the book. You rewrote that line.
Right.
And it's such a common experience for book nerds that I wanted to talk about how and why that happens. So let's jump into the categories a little bit. What do you guys think a director, let's just say the director as sort of the motive artistic force behind a film. What does a director need to consider when they go to adapting a novel? And if you want, put yourself in the director's chair, in your own head. What do you do first when you decide to go adapt a novel?
Well, that's who even knows? Having directed 0 movies,
Yeah.
I have no idea. But I'll tell you what, the ones that I like the best are the ones where it appears that the director began with the universal theme, as we would call it in one of our lit classes, right? The one where the director began with the main idea and worked backward from there from his understanding of what the author was trying to get at and the swing that the author was trying to make. The director says, okay, I understand the author. That's the swing that this story makes. Now I'm going to work towards swinging that same swing. I think that's the kernel of the idea he ought to be working with. And it seems like he is. And the ones that I like, the adaptations that are moving to me.
Right. The ones that are most frustrating are indicative of the fact that the director did not reread the book before trying to make a movie of it. Gave no attempt to really understand what the book had said, but said, hey, cool world, let me write my own story about it.
Okay. Yeah. Like cool world. Like
Right.
What we might say is he sold out for the setting.
Right.
The setting of the book was really cool, and the director made a movie in that setting, and that's the only place they cross.
Or he only liked a particular character.
Or there was a character that was just really, really great.
Right.
Like a fan fiction film almost, rather than an adaptation of the story that already existed.
Or what about
Emily?
A book that isn't that great, or like Pulp Fiction? Like what about James Bond? What about Ian Fleming? I'm sure the books are fine. Like I've heard that they're kind of good, but like, I would give you Daniel Craig's Bond as probably a better work of art.
Right.
You might be right.
I speak from not very much experience
with Bond.
Books,
sure. But no, you're right. I think we've already orbited 2 of the main categories, at least as I could gin them up. We've got poaching on the one hand. I think we'll call it poaching.
I love that.
Which is noting a setting or noting a character or maybe a particular situation, or maybe it's even the plot, but we want to chuck everything else. We don't like where it was set. We don't like the names of anybody. We just like the events. We're going to poach it and make our own thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then we've got bad books made into great movies, which I think is a category. I mean, there's a handful of them. Bond is a great example.
I think Bond is a really good example because, Ian Fleming it's Pulp Fiction for sure. And the movies last way better. They have way longer lives and are way more significant contributions to Western culture than the novels were.
There's a better genre for it.
Mm-hmm.
So then all of that is set in contrast to a straight across adaptation, where, as Dad said a second ago, the author aims to, or the director aims to, sidle up next to the author and say, I see your point. Let's do it just like you did it.
It looks like this.
Or here's your point. I'm placing myself intentionally in conversation with you. I acknowledge your point. I honor what this book was doing, and I have something to say of my own, but I'm going to use you as a means to converse scene with it. Shakespeare is on the brain.
Exactly.
So he does this too, right? He took Hamlet, which was a play that had been put on before, and he was like, good idea. Or Romeo and Juliet. Megan and I just taught that not that long ago. Here's
fascinating.
Romulus. It's an interesting little poem that you got there. I see what you're doing. I would like to add to this conversation, and I'm going to take your story to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which I think is valid in its own sense. Really fun. One of the things I thought. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Megan.
Well, I'm going to change the subject, so go ahead.
Go, Miss.
Well, I was just
Missy,
thinking more along the lines of Shakespeare and what he did. He would troll through history and literature and poetry and pick storylines and combine them together. So I sometimes wonder if he's really intentionally in conversation with all of these, or if they were just like source texts that he went to get ideas.
I have to disagree with you.
Spin-offs.
His history plays are absolutely an intentional conversation with
his histories,
texts.
but what are all of his tragedies that way?
Well, I think Romeo and Juliet, I mean, given that it's been referenced already, absolutely is in conversation with all of the versions before. I mean, all the way back to Ovid, Pyramus, and Thisbe. It's the same plot line, and Shakespeare is absolutely in conversation with it and emphasizing crucial flaws of the main character and making them the zeitgeist of the play. And it's
Oh, interesting.
fascinating to compare the two side by side.
I definitely have
Okay.
had the same thought,
I
though,
stand
Mom,
corrected.
about Shakespeare, because what comes to mind when I think of Shakespeare is this guy probably wrote every story he ever heard, and he was just better than the first guy. So he gets credit for it. It was the best expression of a story that was already in the water, and he gets credit for it. And there's nothing we can do as historians about that, because his is the one that came down to us, right? I'm sure that happens. I'm sure that happens. So that's the last category, I would say. We've got poaching. We've got straight across. We're going to set it in the same time period. We're going to use the same names for the characters. The plot's going to go exactly the way that it did in the book. We're going to do our best to make this as faithful as possible. We've got the best and the worst, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Then we've got ones that are in conversation where we can tell the reading was good on the part of the director, but he's trying to participate in a larger conversation using the work as the substance of that conversation. And then we've got finally what I would say is happening in Shakespeare, which is or what often happens when we adapt Shakespeare for the screen, which is historical resettings, where we're not necessarily changing the plot or the names of the characters. We're changing the setting as a means to applying his idea to a new era or to our own era, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Are we missing anything? Do you think those are kind of the major categories of adaptation?
I don't know, but it must be said that visual performing art is a great medium for that last thing.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the very best literary movies are ones that do that intentionally transpose a classic story to another time and place or another setting of some kind. But always in the service, I think, of having a conversation about themes, right? About the underlying big ideas.
I don't know if you can say always.
You can't say, what do you mean? There are some that don't do it well.
Well, or some that don't even try. But then we'd call those poaching. We're going to call that
We call it poaching.
Right?
That's a different category. It's great. We've got a category for everything.
I think the history of West Side Story is actually really interesting, given all the categories you just listed.
I was going to suggest that we talk about that for a second.
Romeo and Juliet, which Megan already showed us, has a history of its own. And then it's been adapted as a stage play and musical for a different time. And then it became a movie, and then it became another movie. And so now there's like a long history or conversation surrounding this storyline, this tragic love. And now it just goes back and back. And it's like all of them are in conversation with each other. It's like watching, I think there's a way that film adaptation is a little bit like watching the great conversation play out before your eyes.
Or like freezing it at a moment in time. Right. There's a conversation about Romeo and Juliet that's been happening since pre-Shakespeare. Shakespeare was a snapshot of that conversation. People performing it through the ages are snapshots of that conversation. And now we've got West Side Story movies as snapshots of the conversation.
And they all center around, I'll just keep going back to it. They all center around that idea of young, impetuous, star-crossed love.
Right.
And there's the universal Western civilization is mulling over the idea of young, impetuous, star-crossed love in the Romeo and Juliet story. I love it.
So we would have to say then we all come down, and this is a shock to no one. We all come down on still thematic reading, still the most important thing going on, whether we're addressing a film or a novel.
Although I think West Side Story is actually different in that it comes down on a different emphasis than Shakespeare. Shakespeare's concerned with some of the moral questions of the parents and the relationships between the parents and the children and the decisions that the children make. Whereas Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim were maybe more concerned with, I mean, they take up those issues too, but the real emphasis is on the plight of New York City.
Right, the society.
Social justice issues, yeah.
Yeah, the parents are the
conspicuously
cops,
absent, actually.
the developers.
Right. So wouldn't that fall into the category then of in conversation with a previous work? or
So, yeah.
the new story is an iteration of an old one. So you're not just transposing it from play to movie, but one story to another. It's a meta work.
So that's a little, go ahead, Dad.
I was just going to say, I'd have to say that is every participant's prerogative. Every participant in the great conversation, when it comes time for him to give a reading of the idea in question, the theme in question, the work in question, is his prerogative to say, I want to emphasize this or that aspect of it. I want to apply it to this or that situation. But that becomes powerful and engrossing and compelling and transcends the lines between genres, the more that it's faithful to the original idea. In the case of the Romeo and Juliet, it's young, impetuous, star-crossed love. And isn't that a thing? Don't teenagers just up and do that? We all know it, right? Yeah. And let's have a conversation about all the ramifications, social, political, cultural, racial, whatever,
corporeal,
over the course of centuries. Every contribution to that conversation is potentially really compelling.
Okay, good. That gets to the next question I wanted to ask is it okay when we're talking about a resetting historically of a classic story, is it necessary in order for it to be a faithful adaptation? Is it necessary that it only sidle up alongside the author and deliver his point? Or is it okay that it respond and say, yes, but, or yes, and, right?
That's with the fan fiction thing, right? It's more derivative when you go the second way.
Oh, I disagree. I think that my favorite film adaptations are firmly towing the line between faithfully rendering the author's work and doing their own thing, looking at it and saying, but how about this? What about an addition here? What if we took that guy out? Loudly interpreting the author's work. So that, like Dad said at the very beginning of today's podcast, their voice is the one that you're hearing. It's like the director is aware, in my favorite versions at least, of books made into movies. You're aware from the very beginning that you're getting the director's reading, and he is in conversation loudly with the original author. Those are my favorites, when you can hear the director.
That's really interesting. I might agree with you about that. And since we're not going to do an episode zoom in on it, I'm going to bring up the Lord of the Rings, which is such a topic of controversy. I mean, real Tolkien nerds are split right down the middle on whether Peter Jackson's legendary Lord of the Rings trilogy, which won just a bucket of Oscars, whether it's good or not. And the conversation has all sorts of depth. I mean, there are some people who are willing to say it's terrible he didn't include Tom Bombadil.
Wow.
I've talked to them.
Whoa.
It's terrible he didn't include Tom Bombadil. Which criticism I don't think really holds a lot of water. The reasons he cut Tom Bombadil make a ton of sense to me, and I don't think it hurt the end product of the film really at all.
Right.
But then there are also people whose criticisms hold a little bit more weight. Like, for example, they rewrote Captain Faramir's character pretty significantly. The actions that he takes towards some of our other important characters in the movie are super different from the actions that he takes towards them in the book. And it sort of wrecks the punch of his storyline.
Infamously, the fact that Frodo rejects Sam.
Right.
Yeah.
Never
Frodo
happens,
and Sam have
people.
a falling out halfway up the winding stair. That's a little unforgivable, Pete. Right? So on the other hand, I'm completely willing, while picking all of those nits, I'm completely willing to say this was a faithful and wholehearted adaptation of Tolkien's story. And I think it works. So it's interesting to me that we can say both of those things. You tweaked some stuff, you changed some stuff, and yet I feel really confident that you knew exactly what you were doing and it works.
Right. That you changed it on purpose.
It's a conversation about whether or not we're going to allow such a thing as adaptation in our world, right? And then how we define a good one versus how we define a bad one, given that we will allow adaptations.
Right.
What's a good one and what's a bad one?
Maybe you have to say that a film is not a book, that it doesn't replace the book.
Yeah.
Whether it's narrating the story as faithfully as possible and giving us that reading, or it's coming along and interacting with the ideas in the story by making changes so as to bring up a discussion about the particulars.
Mhm.
Either way, it's not the book.
Yeah.
Right. It's some
And
other
we-
thing.
It's another thing altogether.
And maybe we get confused when we see the same title for both.
Well, I think kids
Right.
do in particular. I remember taking a kid to the library and trying to find this kid who shall remain nameless.
Was it
Trying
me?
to- it was not you.
Okay.
It was one of your friends trying to
gracious.
help this kid find any book that he would take home and read. His mother was like, please, can you get him to read a book? I was like, yeah, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I take him to town and we're sitting in the library. How about this one? This is a really neat book. This story's about this, this, and this. And I've seen it. You've seen it. Have you read it? No, I haven't read it. But I've seen it. It's the same. Well, but it's not. It's the same. I don't want it. I mean, I really had to go ways to try to find some book that this kid had not seen already.
Right. I was once on a track bus with this guy who refused to wear pants in the wintertime. He literally wore shorts year round.
It's a real
I
bright
could never
Not what I
have
thought
predicted
you
you
were
would
gonna
say
like
that.
6'4",
Yeah.
He was like 6'3", 6'4", just this big dude. And he evidently had enough on him just with his own body fat that he wasn't cold. And so that was one of the remarkable things about him. But at one point I said, hey man, what have you been reading recently? Which is such a homeschooler way to try and start a conversation on a public school track bus. And he said, nah, I don't really read books. And I said, how come? He said, because it ruins the movies.
oh, buddy. First of all, put some pants on. And second of all,
put some pants on. That made me feel righteous for years. Made me feel righteous in my opinions for years and years.
But it's such an interesting question because over on the How to Eat an Elephant podcast, we have been saying for quite a
Oh, yeah.
while that we actually think it's worthwhile to watch the BBC adaptation of War and Peace before you go to reading the book.
We can't
because it
talk
gives
about that
you-
much yet, though, because that's going to be
Right.
a whole episode
But
later.
the principle,
No,
right? The principle is that it gives you a lifeline through a very unwieldy and long book.
Mhm.
True.
My mother used to teach Shakespeare a lot, speaking of Shakespeare only. And she used to tell the kids to go get master plots. She told me that the librarians at the schools used to keep master plots behind the desk so that kids couldn't, quote unquote, cheat.
Good.
She's like,
Oh,
she went in and said, let my kids access master plots, which is like, Cliff's Notes or Schmoop or whatever. For plot line, she'd say, go read the plot line. We're going to be discussing this play in class, and you're going to have a really hard time following the language if you don't already know the storyline. So it's the same basic idea.
Mhm.
right. Here's a way to open the door for you into what is a great work of literature, and we'll take care of walking over that threshold later.
Yeah, she also added something snarky like, if I don't ask them anything more than the plot line, then they deserve an A.
Awesome.
Nice. That's
That
great.
sounds like your mother.
But the opposite also holds true. Ian, I have not to this day been able to get you to watch the Lily James Rebecca because you refused to watch it until you read the book.
It's true.
And you haven't read the book.
I haven't.
Well,
Well, I
that
think that's fair.
There are
because
some-
That is fair.
spoiler alert.
There are
you know?
camps developing, gentle listeners. You can hear them, I'm sure, but I just want to point out that there are camps
Yeah. Get
developing
ready to
in the
live.
CenterForLit office. Dad, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, it depends on the work of literature that we're talking about, whether any movie adaptation is a spoiler or not. And they're the ones that are plot heavy and plot driven. It's going to be easy to spoil those. But I wanted to make another point about adaptations. It's tempting for a guy like me to say a good adaptation is one that is faithful to the details of the original text, the original story. I'm an originalist, right?
Yep.
And it has to have as much of the actual text in it as possible, and all the marks have to be hit. And that is the definition of a good adaptation, except it isn't, because the world is filled with examples of very, very faithful film renderings of novels that stink as movies.
Good
This
point.
book
So-
didn't make a good movie.
Yeah. So if we're going to decide whether adaptations shall be allowed, it's going to be really important for us to define what a good one is.
Yeah.
And that's a discussion about movies as much as it's a discussion about books.
Agreed.
So I'm
Couldn't agree
looking
more.
forward to this conversation because I want to know more about how the movie sausage is made.
Yeah,
Mm.
me too. Well, I think, I'm excited to read more about it as we go along and bring interesting tidbits to the rest of you, because I'm likewise fascinated by that very thing. It occurs to me though that in this pursuit, we all have a tool, which is that we are good at reading stories. And we're good at looking at the novel itself and deciding what is the main thing the author uses to make his point. Because I would say that if I were in the director's chair, to go back to the original question, one of the first things I would do is decide what kind of an author am I dealing with? Is this guy a character develop? Is this Dickens, right? Is Dickens interested? Dickens is interested in characters primarily. That's the medium he uses. Or am I dealing with Tolkien, whose primary medium is setting? Or am I dealing with Hemingway, whose primary medium is clipped dialogue, right? I mean, what kind of what does he emphasize? I'll try and emphasize that element as well. And whether the details of the plot come out exactly the same or not, I'm going to give the sense and the spirit of the work because I'm going to choose the same element to emphasize. That's what Peter Jackson does well, right? He says, here's a vision of the setting of Middle Earth that will replace your imagination, I promise. And anybody that has seen those movies and then read those books, even if you'd read the book before you saw the movie, we're going to end with that question, but even if you'd read the book before you saw the movie, I promise you, Éomer of Rohan looks like that forever.
Yep.
That's a good looking warrior, right?
I think it's interesting how a good film adaptation can also give you new eyes to see the book with. We're not treating it in this series, and so I was thinking about the new Emma. With what's her name, Anna Taylor-Joy. It was great in that it emphasized the grittiness of Austen's work, right? There's even a little choice nudity that actually like it draws attention to the bodiedness of the characters. Like our temptation with Austen is to idealize the romance, and we miss the fact that she's just talking about the mundane embodiedness of people and their creatureliness, and that adaptation did a really good job of
maintaining the humor that Austen is famous for, actually.
And it drops itself into the literary conversation by refocusing the way that we talk and think about Austen.
I like that.
I do too.
Well, I can tell that I'm going to spend a lot of time listening in this particular podcast.
Why would that be?
She says saltily.
I don't believe you.
You have as much or more to say than any of us.
No, I do not
What do you
have
mean, Mom?
nearly as much to say about movies as I do about books and novels. So it was really helpful to me when you came up with this idea for this season. My first response is, why are we talking about movies? This is a podcast about books.
Hilarious.
And you basically gave me a little explanation of how this was a valid topic of conversation in BiblioFiles. Give me a little redux of that. Remind me, will you?
I mean, I don't remember exactly what I said at the time, but what I would say in response to it now is that what we're interested in doing is making people good readers of stories more broadly. And the reason we want to do that is because we think the world is one. We think it was spoken into being by a creator God who is telling our stories to us as we live. And so there's a part of making stories and listening to them and reading them and then participating in retelling them to each other. That's living in the image of God. And I think that's important. And one of the ways that our culture does that right now is an explosion of visual art. We have film and television series, and we have individual movies, which I would liken to the individual movie is like a short story, and the television series is more like a novel. We're telling stories on the screen. And so why wouldn't we talk about all the stories we can get our hands on and develop the same set of muscles for talking about film that we have about novels?
Especially since over and over again, some significant percentage of the time, when a movie maker goes to find material for a new story to tell, he looks back into the literary past and grabs one of the great ones. And so there is an inherent crossover between these two media, these two genres, that it behooves all good readers to be aware of. And to treat this visual storytelling medium as a literary thing.
Okay, what would you say to people that to detractors, let's call them detractors, that say
We don't have any
that,
of those in the podcast, do we?
no, because I watch movies too. I like movies. That say that the movie version of if you go to a movie as opposed to the book, then you're being lazy. It's a lazy way to get your story.
Well, that is actually
It doesn't engage your brain.
That is a reformulation of the final question of the show today. And the way I was going to phrase it is, should one read the book or watch the movie first? And if you feel morally convicted about this, you are free. You are free. This is a safe space. You can say exactly what you think on this topic, but I want to hear from each of you in turn, starting with Missy.
With me? Oh, starting with me. Thank you. Okay. I think that it doesn't matter whether you start with a book or you start with a movie, as long as
I don't believe you.
I was going to say,
you can't skip the book. You
Okay.
can watch the
it
movie
is
first
your
if you
voice
prefer.
in my head that says something different than that.
I'm willing to hear you out here.
Here's my thought. You can watch it first if you want to, and then go read the book and compare. Or you can read the book, watch the movie, and then go back to the book again. Here's my thing. Once you've seen the movie, it is really hard, I think, to imagine anything except the characters that particular director has chosen. So
Yep.
I prefer reading the book first, because your own imagination comes up with what this person looks like. And then when you watch the movie, you are in dialogue with the director and the producer.
That's a good argument
That would be
for
my
reading the
preference.
book first. That's a compelling argument.
But I'm not going to make it a rule.
Because
Let
she
me jump
knows
in.
better.
That shows significant personal growth on your part.
I was going to say, I didn't think Mom would say it, but I was going to say, I don't think it matters, because if we publicly advocate rereading, which we do,
Yeah, we do.
if we publicly advocate conversation being the point, conversation about ideas back and forth being the point, then our experience with a book and our experience with a movie are going to be two instances where we enter the conversation through different doors. And as long as we understand, in the case of an adaptation, which came first, and we keep that in our heads,
And we don't attribute it to the author of the book necessarily.
right. As long as we're grown-ups about it, and we realize that Boz Luhrmann's Great Gatsby is as much Boz Luhrmann as F. Scott Fitzgerald, fine. So when I was your father and you were in my house, I would have stood with your mom and said, we're reading the book first. Now that we're all grown up, I don't think it matters.
Wow. Okay. I wasn't expecting either of those.
Yeah.
So color me shocked.
But I do double down on what Mom just said about the book providing a unique opportunity to engage your own imagination first, so that then your reading can be in conversation with a director's reading. I love that idea.
Yeah, I think that's powerful. Emily?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree. I wouldn't. So just for the sake of not reformulating everything that was said, I guess I would narrow it down a bit and say I really liked what was said earlier about if you're just the practical decision of trying to decide between the two. I like the distinction of plot and the kind of plot that it is. If it's a murder mystery, or if it's some kind of suspenseful plot, then probably you should read the book first, because that's going to be a more enjoyable experience, and the movie would ruin it. But if it's something where it would be helpful to watch the movie first, or if while you guys were talking, I was thinking, yeah, but just because I've seen Twilight doesn't mean I'm going to read it. Or if it's just,
Right.
that can be a way to gauge whether or not it's even worth reading a book.
Well, it does. What you're basically saying is, do I want to be in conversation with the culture, or do I want to be in conversation with the author and the director? Because if it's just the culture, if I just want to be culturally literate about a storyline, then, take your pick. If it's Buzz
I see your
Luhrmann's
point.
movie just came out and you just need to be literate enough to have a dinner time conversation with somebody about that movie, great. But what you really wanted to do is be in conversation with the author. That's something different.
Well, sort of. I would say that for my last example, that's also having a conversation with the culture. But the last thing I wanted to say actually had to do with Mom's question, which I think, Ian, is actually slightly different than the one that you've posed. And it had something to do with whether it's lazy to watch the movie. And I would say, no matter what you choose, which I don't think ultimately matters that much, whichever one, you have to use your mind while you're
Gotta not be
doing it.
lazy.
I think there's a lazy way to read a book too.
Mhm.
I think more people do that than we think. I do it. I won't leave myself out of that. So I just would encourage us to no matter which adaptation or original we view, to use our minds in doing so.
Agreed.
Mm.
Agreed. Megan.
Well, I don't know if I have anything other to add to the conversation, because I agree with all three of you who've gone before. But as I was thinking about it, I think that if we come in with the assumption that our minds will be on for the enterprise, whether you're watching the movie or reading the book, then you can actually use your judgment depending on what art form, what format the conversation of that art form is going to be. For example, War and Peace is going to be sweeping and historical in nature, as well as a commentary on character and theme. And as a result, you might need a little historical précis to help you get to the meat of the storyline. That being said, I would advise watching the movie first. It is a great abstract of the history, so that you can get to the meat of the novel and kind of see the end from the beginning in some ways. I don't think that's true of every work, but I think it helps to make the decision on an individual basis, and assuming that we're talking to adults who have minds alive and awake and are going to bring those into the process. I think that analyzing the format of your novel or of the piece of art was helpful in the decision.
I think that's great, because it brings to mind the fact that there's context for a book, just like there's context for a movie. And one of the contextual elements of a movie is that, or if it's an adaptation, is the author. And that's one of the things that you have to consider when using your mind to encounter an adaptation.
What would you say,
young
Ian?
children, it would be important to maybe to have them read the story first. And one of the reasons why is I remember watching Anne of Green Gables before I read the stories. And once I had watched the movie, to go to the story, it was such a faithful rendering of what was in the novel. Like even the dialogue was the same, that I feel like it really was like, well, I've already read this.
Like
I feel like I've already read
loss.
this. Do I feel like it's what?
Is that really a loss? Did you just really
well, I will never know
by having
I will
Megan
never
follows
know,
as
honestly,
your Anne?
because there's more than one storyline. Like it was a series, right? She wrote Anne of Avonlea and Anne of the Island, and
I think they got out to the universe eventually.
Anne of the world.
Rilla,
Anne of South Africa.
There were so many different storylines that she developed over time in this series of hers. And I've always felt like I want to read these. I really want to sit down and read these. But every time I start at the beginning and I think, I feel like I've
seen this already.
Yeah, I feel like I saw this already.
So I have an example of that sort of takes the other tack. I totally agree with you about Anne of Green Gables. I've never made it through the novels because of having watched the miniseries and loved it. But I had a similar experience with Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. My first contact with which was that BBC miniseries with Claire Foy and Matthew M.
Wait,
last name I can't say.
You didn't
McFadden.
actually.
I had never read it before I saw that.
Should not be hard to say his last name. It's
hadn't either.
Fat Ian. Matthew McFadden.
Matthew McFadden.
Yes,
I love that.
It's Matthew McFadden.
That is beautiful.
That's funny.
You're welcome.
But anyway, I have to tell you that, and maybe this is a testimony to the greatness of Dickens' novel. I don't know, but all of the plot spoilers were spoiled for me.
Right.
The outcome was clear. It was fabulous miniseries. I absolutely loved it. I've seen it like 4 times.
I know.
But
Can't wait to
then-
watch it again.
But then I turned to the novel, and the novel was not ruined for me at all, not in the least. The novel went deeper, and the novel was novelish instead of movie-ish, and it was glorious. And I would have to say that I had the War and Peace experience as you guys are talking about. I got a little précis of a long, involved, character-laden novel, and so I knew what was coming, and didn't wreck a thing. So how do you explain that? I don't know.
Did you see Claire Foy as you were reading?
No,
You didn't.
I
no,
didn't either. And I had the same
Nope.
experience as Dad.
because
So
it had
this
the
is-
little
This helps
Boz
me
illustrations or whatever.
answer the question myself a little bit, because what I've been chewing on over here is that I really think that this question, my answer to this question is dramatically altered by how good a book we're talking about.
Mhm. Oh yeah.
Because if it's a bona fide classic, if it has survived hundreds of years on its own before receiving a film treatment, no director is going to be able to ruin that. If he's a good
Right.
director,
Yeah.
if he's a good director, he can only add to the glory of something already glorious. If he's a bad director, it's not going to hold a candle to the novel, and the novel will be better in the end anyway. So I don't know that it matters if we're talking about a real classic. I don't know that it matters. Now, kind of plot, I agree with that comment. If it's an Agatha Christie adaptation, go read the book. Go read
Right.
it. Then you can watch the movie and enjoy yourself. But don't get a twist book ruined for you. That would be sad. But I think if we're talking about a classic, I don't know that it matters at all. I think you do whichever one you want. Now, I will say
That's fun.
If the book you're talking about is A, beloved, and B, not a classic, I don't know that I would recommend watching the movie at all.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Because it's easy, comparatively speaking, to ruin a mediocre book, no matter how much you love it. It's easy for a director to get in there and mess with your head and ruin that for you.
Ian, what? Yeah, I was gonna say.
It's off my chest.
There
We're
it
done.
is.
It's good.
Yep, we had to say it out loud.
Moving on.
It's gonna be okay.
Anyways, it's really sad to me.
Yep.
Also, can I just point out an example of poaching before we don't, because we're not going to talk about it later on in this season, but
Yeah.
Yeah, we are. I'm going to talk about poaching later in the season.
well, but no, I don't mean poaching as a category. We're definitely talking about that. I mean, we're not going to talk about this example,
Oh, okay.
which is the fact that, because here's the thing, even poaching can sometimes result in another classic level work. Controversial.
Like a derivative work, you mean?
You might
Let's
need to
hear
give us an example, Ian.
Let's hear it.
No, not derivative. It's its own footprint in the world.
Westworld.
Star Wars,
Oh.
which
Frank Herbert.
ripped off Frank Herbert from
Yep.
start to finish. It is an
Scene for scene, baby.
It is an open poaching of Frank
Of
Herbert's
Dune.
Dune.
Oh, that's just
Oh,
And it has a
Copyright
massive massive cultural impact. It has spawned its own, not just a multi-million-dollar franchise of
Galaxy.
film, but it is a whole universe of other works of art that have come
Can
out
you
of
call
that.
it fan
thing.
fiction? I don't know. He wouldn't have admitted it.
That's slightly different though. He didn't call it Dune, you know. That's not quite the same thing as
It
what
counts
you
as
were saying.
poaching.
But that's like
It's stealing.
yeah.
It's stealing.
Just stealing. Yeah.
Plagiarism
It's
is what it is.
set out to be an adaptation.
That's true.
I
They
was
did
thinking
not-
of like Jurassic Park, which it has the name of the book, and yet it did its own thing gloriously with Jeff Goldblum. You know,
Yes, I do
Right.
know.
Jeff Goldblum. What a man. What a man. Oh, you guys, this is such a great conversation. Well,
Here
I
we
am
go, season. Let's
really
go.
excited to dive in with all of you. Thank you, listeners, for joining us. We're so stoked to be bringing you a new season of BiblioFiles. And if you like what you hear, come on back next week and we will dive into some specific examples of our favorites and maybe not so favorite literary adaptations. Until next time, my friends, happy reading.
Happy reading.
Happy reading.